I stood at the front of the classroom in Columbus, Ohio, introducing myself like every other veteran in the program was asked to do. My name is Hannah Parker. I am 36 years old. I served in Iraq and came back home with scars that never let me forget the fire and smoke of Fallujah. My voice shook slightly, though I tried to steady it because every time I had to mention my service, I could feel the eyes of strangers drifting to my arms. They always drifted to my arms. I wore a simple long-sleeve blouse that day, but the fabric clung tight and the raised scars underneath still shaped the outline. I had barely finished my introduction when I heard the whisper. At first it was faint, then louder. "Monster soldier." My head turned toward the sound, and I saw him, a boy no older than 12, smirking at me like he had found the punchline to a cruel joke. His name was Tyler Miller. He was only in the program because his family wanted him to participate in a community service project. Yet there he was, his small voice cutting through my confidence, sharper than any battlefield memory. "Monster soldier." The words rang in my ears. Some of the other participants chuckled nervously. The instructor shifted in her chair as if she did not quite know how to respond. I forced myself to swallow the bitterness rising in my throat. My heart hammered against my chest as I clenched my hands behind my back, nails biting into my palms to keep me steady. I told myself to ignore him, to let the insult roll off. But the truth was, it did not roll off. It stuck. It burned. It reminded me of every nightmare and every stare I had endured since returning home. I could feel the flush creeping up my neck as if the whole room had turned on me, as if everyone saw me not as Hannah Parker the veteran, but as a freak with marks that should have been hidden. My mouth went dry. I kept speaking about my goals for the program, how I wanted to transition into counseling work for other veterans, but inside I was unraveling. The boy laughed again, this time louder, and I felt a rush of heat in my face. I caught the instructor glancing toward him but saying nothing. That silence hurt more than his words. Silence meant permission. Silence meant I was alone. I wanted to walk out of that classroom to storm away and never look back, but my pride glued me to the spot. I finished my introduction quickly and sat down, my body trembling. My scars prickled under the fabric as if they themselves were responding to the insult, screaming for recognition, for justice. I pressed my arms tightly against my sides, wishing for once I could make them disappear. Tyler whispered again, leaning toward the boy next to him. "Burned soldier. Damaged." The words hit harder than bullets because they came not from an enemy across the desert, but from a child safe in Ohio who would never know what it meant to crawl out of rubble. I bit down on my lip to stop it from trembling. I reminded myself I had faced worse, but still the sting was there. And then something happened that shifted everything. I thought it was just another cruel remark. Another day of humiliation to store in the pit of my memory until I looked up and saw Tyler's stepmother at the back of the room. She had come in quietly, perhaps to check on him. Her eyes landed on me, then dropped to my arms. For a second, she froze, as if the blood drained out of her body. Her face went pale and her lips parted like she had seen a ghost. In that single look, I knew this was not going to be just another ugly moment. Something inside her recognized me. Or rather, she recognized the scars. And that recognition would change everything. When her face drains of color, when her eyes locked on the marks beneath my sleeves, as if they were something she had seen before I realized this was no ordinary insult and no ordinary day. My stomach tightened and I felt the room spinning around me, but I also felt something else, a pull toward the truth that I did not yet understand. I wanted to stop the moment right there, to freeze it, to ask everyone watching the same question that echoed in my head. Have you ever been mocked for something you could not control? Something you carried not by choice, but by survival? I need to know, because carrying scars is not just about the body. It is about carrying the silence of other people too, the silence that lets cruelty echo louder than compassion. If you have lived through that kind of moment, if someone ever tried to reduce your story to a single word of mockery, share it with me. Tell me what you went through. Because I promise you, this story is not just about pain. It is about what happens when truth finally breaks through that silence. I sat back in my chair, pretending to focus on the papers in front of me, but all I could feel was the weight of every stare pressing against my skin. My scars seemed to throb beneath the thin fabric of my blouse, alive with a heat that was not real but felt unbearable. I tried to shift my arms to hide them, yet no matter how I moved, I felt exposed. My chest tightened the way it used to during long nights overseas, when silence meant danger was waiting outside the wire. Only now, the silence came from people who should have spoken up. I told myself I was strong, that I had endured worse. But the truth is, strength feels different when the enemy is not holding a weapon but a cruel word. I heard Tyler whisper again, and it clawed at me more than the sound of mortar shells ever had. I wanted to stand up and shout, to remind them I had once carried brothers and sisters through smoke and rubble, that I had bled for the flag they saluted at football games, that I had paid a price they would never know. But instead, I stayed quiet. My father's voice from long ago crept into my mind, the way he told me as a little girl that silence kept the peace in our house. I hated how those lessons still followed me, how the child who had been controlled in Toledo was still sitting inside me now, begging me to fold, to stay small. I closed my eyes and the classroom faded. For a moment, I was back in Iraq. The acrid smell of burning oil, the taste of dust in my mouth, the sudden roar of an explosion that turned day into night. I felt the searing pain on my arm again, the confusion, the desperate hands dragging me out of rubble. I gasped and opened my eyes back in Ohio, back in that sterile room with white walls and polished desks. I gripped the edge of the table hard enough that my knuckles went white. I whispered to myself, barely audible, "You survived that. You will survive this." Yet my heart still pounded with the shame of being reduced to a punchline. The boy's laughter lingered in my ears, but so did the pale face of his stepmother. She knew something, and whatever it was I sensed, it would not let me bury this day like all the others. I grew up in Toledo, Ohio, in a house that never really felt like home. The walls were thin, the windows rattled in winter, and the kitchen smelled of stale beer more often than it smelled of food. My father, Richard Parker, was a man who carried his authority like a weapon. He believed order came from silence, and silence came from fear. My mother, gentle and worn down by years of his shouting, tried to make peace with casseroles and polite smiles, but her efforts only disappeared into the shadows of his temper. As a child, I learned early that my choices were not mine. My father decided what clothes I wore, how long my hair should be, even whether I could go to a birthday party. Most times, the answer was no. He wanted control, and I was easier to control than the world outside. I remember one Christmas when I begged for a simple pair of roller skates. He told me skates were for careless girls, that I needed to stay steady on the ground. That year, I unwrapped socks instead, while my cousins spun circles on their driveways. There were nights I pressed my ear against my bedroom wall, listening to the muffled sound of my parents arguing in the kitchen. My mother's voice, thin and pleading, always folded under the weight of his. Sometimes there was a crash, a slammed cabinet, a silence that felt like the air itself was holding its breath. I learned not to cry too loudly because tears brought questions and questions brought punishment. At school, I carried that silence with me. Teachers noticed I was quiet, obedient, a girl who never raised her hand unless called upon. What they did not notice was how tightly I clenched my fists under the desk, how I counted the seconds until the final bell when I could rush home and make sure my little brother had finished his homework before Dad came through the door. I became a shield before I even understood what it meant to protect someone. One summer afternoon, I was playing in the yard with neighborhood kids when a boy handed me a baseball glove and asked me to join. I was excited for a second until my father's voice bellowed from the porch, telling me to come inside. He accused me of wasting time, of looking foolish in front of people. That sting stayed with me, the embarrassment of being pulled away while other kids kept playing. I felt like my world was always smaller contained, as if walls and rules followed me everywhere. But even in that strict cage, I discovered sparks of defiance. I loved books, especially the library's collection about faraway places. I would sit cross-legged on my bed, tracing maps of deserts and oceans, dreaming of one day stepping beyond the borders of Toledo. Sometimes, when my father's footsteps thundered down the hall, I slipped my library books under the pillow, hiding them like contraband. Those secret moments of imagination were my rebellion, tiny seeds of independence planted in soil that felt too dry for anything to grow. The irony is that my father wanted me to be tough, yet he never realized he was making me tougher by forcing me to live in constant vigilance. He taught me to anticipate danger, to read a room before speaking, to understand when to hold my tongue and when to breathe through fear. He thought he was breaking me down into obedience, but he was carving survival into my bones. When I think back now, I realize that every scar I carried later was not just from Iraq. Some of them were born in that house in Toledo, invisible, but just as real. The scars of silence, the scars of being told I was small, fragile, incapable of deciding for myself. Those early wounds shaped me into someone who wanted more than escape. I wanted to prove that my life could not be contained by his rules. I wanted to stand taller than the fear he planted in me. By the time I was 16, I would lie awake at night staring at the ceiling, imagining the day I could leave. I promised myself that the next time someone told me no, it would not be the final word. One day, I would find a way to walk beyond those thin, rattling walls and never come back. I just did not know yet where that promise would take me. By the time I reached 18, the walls of our house in Toledo felt smaller than ever. My father still barked orders as if he were a general and I were a private. My mother still tried to soften the edges, but her smiles had grown thinner, stretched like paper about to tear. I wanted a different life, one that did not begin and end under his roof. College was a dream we could not afford. A factory job seemed like a prison with a different name. The only path that felt wide enough, daring enough, was the one I had been secretly considering for years. The Army. Recruiters had been visiting our high school, their pressed uniforms and sharp voices promising travel, education, and purpose. Most of my classmates smiled politely and moved on, but I lingered. I lingered because when I saw them, I imagined a version of myself I had never met. A woman standing tall, answering to no one but herself, serving something larger than Richard Parker's temper. I remember the day I told him. He was sitting in his chair with the evening paper, a half-empty bottle on the table beside him. I stood in the doorway and forced the words out. I enlisted. At first, he laughed a short, bitter sound. Then he set the paper down and his eyes narrowed. "You think you can handle that? You think you're strong enough?" His voice was filled with disbelief, as if the idea of me making my own choice was an insult to his authority. For the first time, I did not flinch. I met his gaze and said, "I am strong enough." I said it even though a part of me shook inside, even though I had no proof yet. My mother stood behind him, her hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes wet. She did not speak, but I saw a flicker of something in her expression, almost like relief. Maybe she hoped I could escape the life she never managed to leave. When I boarded the bus that took me to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, I felt a strange mix of fear and liberation. I pressed my forehead to the window and watched Toledo disappear mile by mile. I thought of the streets where I had walked in silence, the playgrounds where I had been pulled away, the nights of muffled arguments. They faded into the distance, and with each passing mile, I felt the promise I had whispered to myself as a teenager take root. I was leaving, and I was not coming back the same. Basic training was a shock. The heat, the drills, the relentless demands on body and mind pushed me harder than I had ever been pushed. Yet every order shouted at me was easier to take than the ones barked by my father. Because here, the orders had purpose. Here, they were shaping me, not shrinking me. The Army did not care about the girl who had been told no her whole life. They cared whether I could run one more mile, whether I could carry my pack, whether I would stand when I wanted to fall. And I did. I stood. I will never forget the first time I looked at myself in the mirror after completing a long march with the others. My face was flushed sweat dripping my shoulders aching. But there was a spark in my eyes I had never seen before. I was no longer just Richard Parker's daughter. I was Private First Class Hannah Parker. My story had begun to belong to me. When I arrived in Iraq, the air itself felt heavy, a mixture of dust heat and tension that settled into your lungs and never quite let go. Fallujah was a name I had heard back home in news reports, but standing on its streets made the word feel different, alive, almost like it carried a pulse of its own. Buildings stood half-broken wires hung loose from shattered walls, and every corner felt like it might hide danger. The sound that stayed with me most was not the gunfire or the hum of helicopters, but the silence between a silence that pressed against your ears and made every heartbeat louder. I was 20 years old and thought I understood fear, but Iraq taught me new lessons. Days blurred together in patrols under a sun that scorched the back of my neck. Nights stretched out with restless half-sleep, where every noise jolted me awake. The moment that changed me forever came during one of those nights. An explosion ripped through the street where our convoy had stopped. It was sudden, a flash, a roar, then chaos. The blast threw me against a wall fire, searing across my arm and shoulder. For a moment, I thought I had been swallowed by the sun itself. I tried to stand, but my legs buckled, and I remember the smell of burning cloth mixed with dust so thick I could barely breathe. Voices shouted commands blurred, but through it all I felt hands grabbing me, steady and urgent. A woman's voice, sharp and calm in the storm, telling me to hold on. I drifted in and out of consciousness, but I remember the sting of antiseptic, the pressure of gauze against raw flesh, the determination in her tone, as if she refused to let me slip away. Later, I would learn her name, though at that time it was only a face leaning over me, eyes fierce with focus, hands moving with practiced speed. She was a medic, and she kept me alive in the minutes when everything inside me screamed to give up. When I woke in a makeshift hospital, my body wrapped and bandaged, the pain came in waves that stole my breath. I looked down at my arms and saw what was left after fire had touched me. The skin was mottled raw, scarred in ways I knew would never fade. I was alive, but I was marked. Some of the others did not make it back that night, and survivor's guilt wrapped around my chest tighter than the bandages. I told myself I should be grateful, but in the quiet hours I wondered why me? Why had I been saved while others were carried away under flags? The medic who saved me came to check on me once more before I was evacuated. Her face lined with exhaustion, her hands trembling slightly when she thought no one was watching. She told me I was strong, that I would heal, that scars were proof of survival. I wanted to believe her, but lying there in pain, the only thing I felt was the weight of what I had lost. Still, her words planted themselves somewhere deep, even if I could not see it then. Fallujah took pieces of me I would never get back, but it also forged a truth I carried long after the desert sand was gone from my boots. I had survived, but survival had left its mark, and those marks would follow me back to Ohio like shadows that never loosened their grip. Coming home was supposed to feel like victory, but for me, it felt like stepping into a different kind of battlefield. When the plane touched down and I saw the American flag waving outside the window, I thought I would feel proud, relieved, maybe even whole again, but instead I felt smaller, as if the scars on my arms and shoulder were already announcing me before I had the chance to speak. Family and neighbors welcomed me with careful smiles and polite words, but I could see the flicker in their eyes when they noticed the marks I carried. Some tried to hide their stares, others asked questions that cut deeper than they realized. Does it still hurt? Will it ever heal? Can you wear short sleeves again? Each question reminded me that my body no longer belonged just to me. It had become a story written in skin one I could not choose to close. I returned to Toledo for a time, back to the same house with the thin walls, but nothing about it felt the same. My father greeted me with a stiff nod, as if my service was only another challenge to his authority. He told me scars were weakness, that real strength was not letting people see you bleed. My mother hugged me so tightly I could hardly breathe, whispering that she was proud, though I could hear the fear in her voice too, fear that I had brought the war home inside me. At night, I lay awake listening to the familiar creak of the floorboards, but instead of comfort, it brought back the memory of sand crunching under my boots, of doors slamming in a rock before raids, of the sudden silence before chaos. I woke sweating, gasping hands clutching at the sheets as if they were tourniquets. People told me I was safe now, but safety did not live in my mind. It slipped away every time I closed my eyes. Eventually, I left Toledo chasing a chance at peace somewhere else. I tried school for a semester, but classrooms felt too small and I could not sit still while professors spoke about theories of war, as if lives had not been lost in the dust I still smelled. I tried jobs here and there, but every interview felt like a test I could not pass once eyes dropped to the scars I carried. So I moved from one town to the next, searching for a place where I could be Hannah Parker without footnotes, without the constant reminder that survival had branded me. I settled in Columbus because it felt large enough to disappear into, yet small enough to find community. I signed up for a veteran transition program hoping to rebuild, to learn how to move forward. On the first day, I told myself this was the moment I would stop being defined by Fallujah. I believed maybe here people would look past the scars, but deep down, I knew the truth. Scars are never invisible, not really. They speak even when you are silent. They whisper in the pause of strangers, in the pity of neighbors, in the laughter of a child who does not know what you endured. That was the truth I carried with me into that classroom, into that seat, where Tyler Miller would point and laugh, where his words would drag me back through every moment of shame I thought I had left behind. I had survived Iraq, but I was still fighting a war back home, a war for dignity, for recognition, for the right to live without being reduced to the marks on my skin. I thought joining the veteran transition program in Columbus would give me structure, a chance to move forward, but instead it became another battlefield I had not prepared for. In the beginning, I tried to keep my head down. I attended every session, completed every assignment, forced myself to shake hands with strangers who looked at me with polite smiles. I even tried to convince myself that the stares at my arms were not real, that maybe I was imagining the way eyes lingered when I rolled up my sleeves. But then there was Tyler Miller. He was only 12, far younger than the others, but his presence filled the room with a kind of reckless energy. At first, I ignored him. He was just a boy, too young to understand the weight I carried, too young to know the stories scars tell. Yet cruelty has no age limit. His first remarks had been whispers. Little words slipped between laughter with his friends, words like monster and freak. I clenched my jaw and told myself not to react. Veterans are trained to endure, but ignoring cruelty does not make it vanish, it makes it grow. Soon the whispers became louder, sharper. One day, after I had presented a small project on fire safety, Tyler snatched the paper from my hand, crumpled it, and tossed it to the floor. He laughed and said, "Burned soldier does not need paper. Burned soldier only needs pity." The room went quiet. I bent down, picked up the torn sheet, and sat back in my chair without a word. My chest ached with humiliation, but I swallowed it the way I had swallowed silence my entire childhood. Later that week, the program held a small ceremony to recognize participants for their progress. I had worked hard on my assignments, staying up nights, writing reports, trying to prove I was more than the scars on my body. When they called my name, I walked forward to receive a certificate. The applause was polite, scattered. But just as I turned to face the room, Tyler lunged forward, grabbed the certificate, and tore it down the middle. The sound of ripping paper echoed like gunfire. He smirked and said, "Damaged goods do not deserve awards." Laughter rippled from the back of the room. My stomach clenched. I stared at the torn halves in my hands, my vision blurring. I wanted to shout, to slam my fist on the table, to remind them that every scar on my body was paid for in blood and sacrifice, but my voice stuck in my throat. Instead, I forced myself to stand still until the moment passed. That night at home, I could not look in the mirror without hearing his words. Damaged goods. My reflection wavered through tears I refused to let fall, but my lips trembled anyway. I traced the lines of my scars with my fingers, remembering the medic's voice in Iraq, telling me they were proof of survival. Yet now, all I heard was the voice of a child reducing me to something broken. The morning after Tyler tore my certificate, I sat in my car outside the community center for a long time, hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles whitened. I told myself to walk in with dignity, to demand that someone in charge finally see what was happening. I had spent my life following orders, learning how to swallow pain, but this was different. This was supposed to be a safe place, a program built to help veterans like me rebuild. I walked into the office of the coordinator, a woman named Mrs. Alvarez, carrying the two halves of my certificate folded carefully in my hand. I set them on her desk without a word. She looked down, sighed, and pressed her fingers to her temples. "Hannah, I am so sorry this happened. Tyler can be difficult. We've spoken to him before. We'll continue to monitor his behavior." Monitor. The word stung. I told her my side, my voice shaking not with fear, but with rage held tight in my chest. He called me damaged goods in front of everyone. He mocked my scars. He humiliated me while you and the others sat in silence. Do you understand what that does to someone who already carries shame like a shadow? Her eyes softened, but her tone was rehearsed professional. I do understand, she said, but you must also realize that bullying is complicated. Tyler comes from a home that is not easy. His father is struggling. His family situation is, well, complex. I stared at her, barely able to believe what I was hearing. I wanted to ask her if my family had been easy, if growing up with a violent father in Toledo had been simple, if nearly dying in Fallujah was the kind of privilege that excused others from cruelty. Instead, I bit down on my words and tasted blood. Complex. That was her excuse. I left her office with the halves of my certificate still in my hands, more broken than before. A week later, I asked for a meeting with the program director, Dr. Norris. She welcomed me with a warm smile spoken gentle tones and filled the air with long phrases about restorative justice and peer mediation. She told me there was a comprehensive anti-bullying initiative being implemented across the program. She promised Tyler would participate in conflict resolution sessions, that we would all benefit from assemblies about acceptance and inclusion. I sat there nodding mechanically, but inside I felt the same hollowness I had felt in Iraq when promises of quick victories turned into endless deployments, words without weight, plans without action. When I asked directly if Tyler would face consequences for tearing my certificate, she hesitated, then said, "Discipline must always be balanced with understanding." I walked out of her office with the same silence pressing against me that had pressed against me as a child when my father's anger went unchecked. But silence does not erase pain, it deepens it. That evening, as I cooked a simple meal, my phone rang. The voice on the other end was harsh, commanding. "This is David Miller. You stay away from my boy." "You think you're some kind of hero, but you're just damaged goods." My breath caught. He kept talking, his words sharp and heavy, like he wanted to crush me over the phone. "Don't bring your problems into my family," he said. "Don't you dare." I hung up my hands, shaking so badly I nearly dropped the phone. My chest heaved, not just from anger, but from the echo of every time a man's voice had tried to tell me I was nothing. That night, I could not sleep. I lay staring at the ceiling, hearing my father's voice overlap with David's hearing, Tyler's laughter mixed with the silence of the program staff. I realized something then, something I had been trying to ignore. The system was never going to save me. The system was designed to keep peace on paper, not in reality. If I wanted this to stop, if I wanted dignity, I would have to fight for it myself. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the shadows from the streetlight outside sliding across the walls like ghosts that refused to let me rest. My body was exhausted, but my mind would not stop moving, circling the same memories over and over until they became louder than the silence around me. I saw Tyler's smirk, heard his laughter echo in the classroom, felt again the sting of the certificate tearing in my hands. I heard Mrs. Alvarez's careful voice telling me bullying was complicated, Dr. Norris with her polished words about restorative justice, and David Miller's threats still buzzing in my ear like static. They all blended together until I could not separate one voice from another. It was the same voice I had grown up with in Toledo, the same voice that told me to stay small, stay silent, survive by obedience. I turned onto my side, pressed my arm against the pillow, felt the raised lines of my scars through the thin fabric of my shirt. I whispered to myself that these were proof of survival, but even that truth felt fragile under the weight of humiliation. I closed my eyes, and for a moment I was back in Fallujah, smoke and fire, the sudden crack of an explosion, my own scream swallowed by dust. I remembered the medic pulling me out, telling me to hold on, telling me I would make it. I had made it, but for what? To come home and be told by a child that I was damaged goods. To hear his father call me broken. To sit in silence while people who were supposed to help chose words over action. My chest tightened, and I realized I was clenching my fists so hard, my nails dug into my palms. I could almost hear my father's footsteps in the hall from years ago, the way fear used to keep me frozen. I felt the same weight now, but this time something inside me pushed back. Not again. The words came unbidden, sharp and steady. Not again. I will not live my life bowing my head to cruelty, whether it comes from a father from a system or from a boy who thinks scars make someone less. I sat up, swung my legs over the side of the bed, and felt the cool floor against my feet. The anger that had been simmering now burned clear, but beneath it was a calm resolve. If no one else was going to stop this, then I would. I did not know exactly how yet, but I knew one thing with certainty. This time I would fight back, and I would not fight in silence. The next morning I woke with a heaviness in my chest, but it was not the weight of defeat. It was the steady pressure of decision. For too long I had let other people's voices shape the way I moved, the way I carried myself, the way I even thought about my scars. That had been true in Toledo, it had been true in Fallujah, and it had been true in the sterile classrooms of the transition program. But lying awake through the night had carved something new into me, a line I was not willing to let anyone cross again. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table staring at the rising steam. My hands trembled as I folded the torn certificate one last time and slid it into a drawer. It was not evidence anymore. It was a reminder, a symbol of how far humiliation had been allowed to go. I pulled out a small notebook I used to keep track of thoughts and training routines, and on the first blank page, I wrote 3 words in block letters, "No more silence." Seeing them written in ink steadied me. I began to plan. I looked up the address of the Miller family in the school directory, my finger tracing the line as if it were a map to something inevitable. The idea of confronting them filled me with both dread and resolve. I knew David Miller was a man who believed in intimidation, a man who thought his voice could crush anyone who challenged him. That thought did not weaken me, it clarified my purpose. I had faced fire, I had faced the collapse of walls and ceilings, I had faced death itself. A man shouting in his driveway could not compare. Still, I was not careless. I gathered what little I had that could serve as proof if things turned ugly. Old medical records from the VA, photographs from my deployment letters from fellow soldiers who had written about my recovery. I placed them in a folder and slid it into my bag. If David tried to twist the truth, I would not only answer with words, I would answer with facts. As the sun climbed higher, I felt a nervous energy move through me, sharp but controlled. I paced the room, rehearsing what I might say, hearing the words out loud so they would not falter when the moment came. You will not call me damaged. You will not raise a son who believes cruelty is strength. You will see the truth you've tried to bury. By evening, the decision was sealed. I locked the door behind me and stood for a moment in the cool Ohio air, my breath visible in the fading light. I was not walking toward a fight I hoped to win. I was walking toward a truth that needed to be spoken. For the first time in years, I felt the silence breaking inside me, and I knew I was ready to face the Miller family on my own terms. Dayton sat less than an hour from Columbus, yet the drive felt longer than some convoys I had ridden overseas. The highway blurred past my window, endless fields giving way to tired neighborhoods, but my focus stayed sharp on the address scribbled on a slip of paper tucked in my jacket. I rehearsed my words as I drove my hands tight on the steering wheel, heart thudding in a rhythm I had not felt since deployment. This was not combat, but it felt like a mission, and I treated it as one. When I turned onto their street, the atmosphere shifted. The Miller house stood among a row of modest ranch homes, but there was something about it that seemed heavier, more unwelcoming than the rest. The grass in the front yard was overgrown patches of dirt where children should have played. A rusted pickup truck sat in the cracked driveway, its front bumper held by tape, and a tarp covered what looked like a motorcycle half hidden in the garage. The paint on the siding peeled in strips exposing gray wood beneath, as if the house itself carried its own scars. I pulled my car to the curb and sat for a long moment studying every detail. The way a curtain shifted upstairs quick and nervous. The way the porch steps sagged one broken at the corner. It felt like a place that had learned to hold secrets. My stomach tightened, but I refused to let fear speak louder than resolve. I checked the folder in my bag one more time, sliding my fingers across the VA papers and photographs, reminders that my scars were not shame, they were evidence of survival. I tucked the folder back, zipped the bag, and stepped out into the cool evening air. Each footstep toward the porch echoed louder than it should have, as if the ground itself understood what I was about to face. When I reached the door, I paused, lifted my hand, then knocked firmly. The sound carried inside a hollow thud that made my pulse quicken. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, heavy footsteps moved across the floorboards. The door creaked open, and there stood David Miller. He was taller than I expected his frame, broad, his jaw shadowed with stubble. His eyes narrowed the moment he saw me, recognition flickering instantly. His voice carried the same sharp edge I had heard on the phone. "What do you want?" I met his stare without flinching. "We need to talk," I said, my tone steady, controlled. "About your son." His lip curled into something between a sneer and a smile. "You're the soldier, aren't you? The one who thinks my boy owes her respect." His gaze dropped deliberately to my arm, and though my sleeve covered most of the scars, he lingered there as if he could see beneath the fabric. I felt my body tense, memories of my father's disapproving eyes flashing through me, but I held firm. "This isn't about respect," I replied evenly. "This is about decency. He's been tormenting me in class, mocking my scars, tearing my work apart in front of others. And you called me yourself to make sure I stayed silent." David leaned one arm against the doorframe, his posture meant to intimidate, his voice low and mocking. "You think you can come here and tell me how to raise my son? You think your war stories make you better than the rest of us?" I inhaled slowly, steadying the rush of anger that threatened to rise. This wasn't a battlefield where shouting or fists could win. This was a test of control. I took one small step forward, close enough to make him shift back ever so slightly, and I said, "I'm here because the silence ends tonight." His eyes darkened, and for a moment the air between us thickened like the seconds before a storm. He didn't close the door. He didn't invite me in. He just stood there, as if daring me to keep standing on his porch. I squared my shoulders, ready for whatever came next. David pushed the door wider, not to welcome me, but to make a show of his presence. He stepped onto the porch close enough that I could smell the sharp tang of whiskey on his breath. His voice dropped lower, meant to cut, meant to dominate. "You should have stayed in your lane, soldier. My boy is 12. He can say what he wants. He doesn't need to answer to a woman who came back broken." The word slammed into me harder than the blast in Fallujah ever had. Broken. It was the same word Tyler had spit in the classroom, the same word my father used when I cried as a child, the same word that tried to define me every time someone looked at my arms. I felt the heat rise in my chest, but I forced my face into stillness. Controlled fury is a weapon if you know how to hold it. I stood taller, my voice steady. "Your son doesn't need permission to be cruel. He needs an example. And right now, the only example he has is a father who thinks intimidation is strength." His jaw tightened and he leaned closer, his shadow falling across me. "You don't get to lecture me. You don't get to walk up to my house and talk about strength. I built this roof. I feed that boy. What do you have? Scars and stories." His words struck at every vulnerable place inside me, yet instead of shattering me, they sharpened my resolve. I took a slow breath and answered, "You're right. I do have scars. And every one of them tells a story of survival, of courage, of standing when others fell." "What do your scars say, David? That you hide behind anger because you're afraid of the truth?" For a second, his eyes flickered, then hardened again. He spat onto the porch and said, "Truth is you came back less than whole. My son sees it. I see it. And maybe you should stop pretending those marks mean anything but failure." My hands curled into fists at my sides, my nails digging into my palms. I remembered the faces of the soldiers I served with, the ones who never made it home, the ones I carried in my memory every single day. I thought of the medic who bent over me in that dark street, her voice steady while chaos burned around us. I wasn't going to let this man take their sacrifice and twist it into shame. I lifted my chin, my voice quiet but edged with steel. "I didn't come here for your approval. I came here because your son thinks cruelty is a game, and he learned that from watching you." Every time you belittle, every time you lash out, he copies you, and I won't let him grow into a man who thinks tearing others down makes him strong." He let out a harsh laugh, shaking his head. "You think you can save him. You think you can march in here and change what he is. He's mine. He'll always listen to me, not to some washed-up soldier with burn marks." I felt the old fear then, the one that used to paralyze me in my father's house, the one that told me to shrink and obey. But I had spent years learning to rise against it. My voice cut through his laughter, clear and deliberate. "I don't need to save him. I just need to make sure he knows the truth. And I will, whether you like it or not." For the first time, he stepped back just half a pace, but enough that I saw the shift in his posture. My calm unnerved him more than anger ever could. His fists flexed at his sides as if he wanted to end the conversation with force, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the steadiness in my eyes. Maybe it was the memory of the call he had made the proof I carried in my bag. The air between us felt like the second before a lightning strike, charged and dangerous. And just when I thought his anger might erupt, I heard footsteps behind him. A woman's voice cut through the tension. "David, what's going on?" He froze. His shoulders stiffened, and I looked past him to see her standing in the doorway, her eyes falling on me, then on my arms. In that instant, her face drained of color, her lips parting in shock. She knew me, or more precisely, she knew the scars. The woman in the doorway looked like she had seen a ghost. Her hair was pulled back in a loose bun, streaked with gray, that made her seem older than she was, and her hands gripped the frame as if she needed its support to keep standing. Her eyes locked on me, not on my face, but on my arms, where the sleeve of my jacket had shifted just enough to show the edge of a scar. I saw her lips tremble before she whispered almost to herself, "I know those scars." The words hit me harder than David's insults, harder than Tyler's laughter. My breath caught, and I stared at her confusion, mixing with something deeper, something I could not yet name. David turned annoyed, his voice sharp. "Linda, go back inside. This isn't your business." But she didn't move. She stepped forward, her gaze never leaving me. Her face was pale, her eyes wet, and when she spoke again, her voice cracked. "Hannah Parker, Fallujah, 2008. The ground beneath me seemed to tilt. I blinked, stunned, my throat dry. "How do you know my name?" Her hand lifted, shaking, as if she was reaching for a memory made flesh. "Because I was there," she whispered. "I was the medic who pulled you out." The world around me blurred. The porch, the peeling paint, David's looming figure, they all faded under the weight of her words. My chest tightened as flashes returned the roar of the explosion, the choking smoke, the searing fire across my skin. And then through it all, a voice. Steady, urgent, telling me to hold on. I remembered the touch of hands working quickly, the press of gauze, the sting of antiseptic. I had thought of her voice for years, a lifeline in the chaos, but I had never known her name. Now she stood in front of me no longer just a memory, but a woman whose eyes mirrored the same pain I carried. David's face darkened with confusion and irritation. "What are you talking about?" "Linda, what is this?" She turned to him, her voice firm now, though tears ran down her cheeks. "She was one of mine, David, a soldier I treated in Baghdad after the blast. I saved her life. I could not save them all, but I saved her." I felt the air leave my lungs. My knees almost buckled, not from weakness, but from the sheer force of recognition. For years, I had wondered who that medic was, if she ever thought of me, if she knew I had survived. And here she was, married to the man whose son had mocked me, whose voice had tried to break me again. David shook his head, his disbelief turning into anger. "This is ridiculous! You don't owe her anything. She's just trying to manipulate you to manipulate us." But Linda cut him off, her voice breaking through his bluster like a blade. "I know those scars because I was there when they were made. I watched her fight for her life in the middle of hell, and I have carried the memory of that night every single day since." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. I looked at Linda and saw not just a medic, but a woman carrying her own scars, invisible, but no less deep. She had carried guilt, the weight of choices no one should have to make. I recognized it instantly because I carried it too. Slowly, I nodded, my voice low but steady. I remember you. I remember someone telling me I was going to be okay. That was you. Her tears spilled over as she whispered, "Yes, it was me." For the first time in years, I felt the battlefield collapse into the present. Two lives that had intersected in fire and blood had crossed again, not in Baghdad but on a porch in Dayton, Ohio. The irony was brutal, almost unbearable. The boy who mocked me, the man who threatened me, belonged to the family of the woman who had once saved me. David's anger flickered, but I saw uncertainty creeping into his expression. He looked between us, sensing something had shifted beyond his control. For me, the world was no longer spinning from humiliation. It was spinning from revelation. And in that dizzying moment, I understood something with startling clarity. The scars that had haunted me, the ones Tyler used as weapons, were also the bridge to truth. Linda knew them because she had been there when they were born. And now her recognition was going to change everything. For a long moment, the porch was silent except for the sound of Linda's uneven breathing. She gripped the frame of the doorway with both hands as if it was the only thing keeping her upright. David muttered something under his breath, but she ignored him. Her eyes stayed locked on me, filled with a mixture of recognition, grief, and relief. "Hannah," she whispered again, as if saying my name out loud anchored the memories that had been haunting her. "I cannot believe it is you." I swallowed hard, my chest tight, my voice raw. "You were there. You pulled me out." She nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks now. "Yes, that night in Fallujah. The blast shook the ground like the world itself was cracking open. We lost 2 soldiers in seconds. And then I saw you. I saw the fire on your arm, the blood on your shoulder. You were pinned, barely breathing. I remember the way your eyes looked at me, not with fear, but with something else. Something that begged me not to leave you behind." Her voice broke, but she kept speaking each word, carrying the weight of years. "I made a choice that night. I had seconds. There was another soldier near you, but he was already unconscious. The building was collapsing. The smoke was too thick. I knew I could not carry you both. I chose you, Hannah. And for 5 years, I have wondered if I chose wrong." The confession hit me like a physical blow. My throat tightened as the memories sharpened, as the smell of smoke filled my mind. I could see flashes of the other soldiers' boots in the corner of my vision that night. The chaos, the sound of metal groaning before the wall caved. I had never known the details, never asked, but now hearing her say it, the guilt I had carried took a new shape. I shook my head, forcing the words out. "You saved me. There was no wrong choice. You gave me the chance to live." Linda covered her face with her hands, her shoulders trembling. "But I lost him," she whispered through her fingers. "I lost him because I picked you, and I have carried his face every single day. I left the army 2 years later because I could not walk into another tent, could not touch another wound without hearing his silence." David stood stiff beside her, confusion etched on his face, but I could see anger simmering beneath it. Anger not at her story, but at her vulnerability, her honesty. I stepped closer, my voice steadier now. "Linda, you did what you had to do. You saved the one you could save. That is not failure. That is courage." Her eyes lifted to mine wide with something like hope, though still clouded by guilt. "But you carried those scars because of me," she said. "You walk with them every day." I reached up, pulled back my sleeve, and let the porch light fall on the ridged skin of my arm. "These are not shame. They are proof. Proof that you fought for me when I could not fight for myself. Proof that I lived. And because I lived, I have had the chance to stand here, to face this, to tell you that your choice mattered." The air between us shifted. For years I had carried shame, but in that moment I felt it turn into something else, something closer to pride. And as Linda's tears fell freely, I realized this was not just my healing, it was hers too. David's face twisted as Linda's words filled the air. He slammed his palm against the doorframe so hard, the wood rattled, his voice booming. "Enough of this. I will not have my wife standing here crying over some burned-up memory." He jabbed a finger at me, his eyes full of disdain. "She doesn't deserve your tears, Linda. She doesn't deserve anything. She's a reminder of failure. His words cut deep, but this time they didn't land the way he intended. I saw fear behind his anger. Fear that the truth Linda had just spoken threatened the control he clung to so tightly. I straightened, keeping my voice calm. You call my scars failure, David, but your wife knows the truth. She was there when survival meant everything, and now your son repeats your cruelty because you've taught him that strength means breaking people down. Linda turned on him, then her voice trembling but fierce. David, stop. You don't know what you're saying. You weren't there. You didn't see what I saw. Her eyes were blazing through tears. This woman is alive because I carried her out of hell. Do you understand that? I saved her and I have lived with that night every day. You don't get to stand here and dismiss it like it's nothing. David barked a bitter laugh. So what, Linda? You want to turn her into some kind of hero in our house. You want our boy to look up to her scars instead of me. That's what this is really about, isn't it? His words hung like poison. And then another sound came smaller but sharper, a creak on the stairs inside. I turned my head and saw Tyler standing just behind the half-open door, his wide eyes darting between us. He had been listening. He had heard everything. Linda gasped softly, realizing it too. Tyler, go upstairs. But he didn't move. His young face was pale, his mouth opening and closing as if trying to find words. He looked at his father, then at me, then at the faint line of scars visible under the porch light. His voice, when it finally came, was a whisper. Is it true? You saved her mom. David snapped Tyler. Don't you listen to this nonsense. But the boy's eyes didn't leave me. He stepped forward timidly, his voice cracking. I didn't know. I thought she was just... His words faltered, and I felt my throat tighten. I saw the confusion in him, the fear, the dawning realization that the names he had hurled at me carried weight he couldn't understand until now. Linda wiped her face, her voice softer but urgent. Tyler, listen to me. That night in Iraq, I pulled Hannah out of a burning street. She nearly died. The scars you've been mocking are proof that she lived. They are proof she's stronger than most people ever will be. The boy's lips trembled. He looked at me again, his eyes wide and wet. I didn't know, he whispered. I didn't know. David's face reddened with fury. Enough! Get back inside, both of you. His hand lifted as if he might grab Tyler's arm, but Linda stepped between them, her body tense. No, David. Not this time. The porch seemed to vibrate with the clash. Anger, truth, guilt, revelation, all colliding at once. And in that thick, suffocating moment, I understood that silence was no longer possible. Everything was unraveling, and the boy who had mocked my scars now stood on the edge of understanding their meaning. Tyler's eyes stayed locked on me wide and unsteady, as if the ground beneath him had shifted in ways he couldn't explain. I saw myself in him for a moment. Not the cruelty, but the fear of realizing the story you've been told is not the truth at all. I stepped closer, slow and deliberate, keeping my voice low so it would cut through the thick air without being harsh. Tyler, look at me. These scars you laughed at, they aren't ugly. They aren't shame. They are proof that I walked through fire and lived. Proof that when everything around me collapsed, I refused to give up. You called me a monster, but monsters destroy. Survivors endure. His lips quivered. I didn't mean... His voice trailed off as if the words had turned to ash. Yes, you did, I said gently, not cruelly. You meant it because you didn't know better, because you've grown up believing scars are weakness. That's what happens when no one tells you the truth. But you're old enough now to see it for yourself. These marks on my arms aren't a reason to look away. They are a reason to stand taller. Every line you see is a battle I lived through, not one I lost. Tears began to form at the corners of his eyes. His father scoffed behind him, but Linda shot David a glare so sharp he stayed silent. I kept my eyes on Tyler because this was no longer about David, no longer about his rage. This was about the boy who had been taught cruelty and was finally seeing what courage really looked like. When you called me damaged goods, I continued, you thought you were making me small. But you don't understand, yet survival makes no one small. It makes us strong in ways you can't see until you've lived through something that should have ended you. My scars remind me every day that I chose to fight for life. And Tyler, one day, you're going to face something hard, something bigger than you. When that day comes, I hope you remember what I told you, that strength isn't mocking the wounded, it's standing with them. His face crumpled, then the bravado slipping away like a mask that had been ripped off. He covered his mouth with his hands as sobs broke through. Not the angry tears of a spoiled child, but the raw sound of shame crashing into understanding. I didn't know, he choked out. I didn't know, and I'm sorry. His shoulders shook, his thin frame collapsing into grief too big for his age. I wanted to reach out, but I held still, giving him the space to let it out. Linda wrapped an arm around him, pulling him close, her own tears falling onto his hair. She whispered, "It's okay, son. You know now. That's what matters." I finally let out the breath I had been holding, my chest loosening with a strange mixture of sorrow and relief. The boy who had cut me down with words had broken under the truth of what those scars meant. Not pity, not weakness, but survival. David shifted behind them, furious at losing control, but for the first time in weeks, I felt something stronger than his rage. I felt the power of my own voice of the truth spoken without fear. And as Tyler sobbed into his mother's arms, I knew the silence that had bound me since that classroom had finally shattered. David's face was a storm, his jaw tight, his eyes narrowing with the kind of rage that came from a man losing the grip he thought he had over everyone in his life. He took one step forward, his voice booming across the porch. "Enough of this performance. You don't come to my house, you don't talk to my son, and you don't stand here acting like you're some kind of saint because you crawled out of a fire." His words shook the air, but they didn't shake me. I had been screamed at before by drill sergeants, by commanding officers, even by my own father. I knew how to let rage wash over me without drowning. I kept my voice calm, steady as stone. "I'm not acting like anything, David. I'm telling the truth. And whether you like it or not, your son has heard it." That was when his hand lifted. It wasn't slow, it wasn't uncertain. It was the quick, reflexive move of a man used to ending arguments with force. For a heartbeat, time froze. My body tensed, instincts from years in uniform kicking in, the memory of ducking under falling debris flashing hot in my mind. But before his hand could reach me, Linda stepped between us. Her body blocked mine, her voice sharp as a blade. "Not anymore." The words sliced through the night louder than his shouting. She planted herself firmly in front of me, her arms spread slightly as if she had been preparing for this moment her whole life. David froze his hand, still half raised, shock flickering across his face. Linda's eyes burned with fury, her tears gone, replaced with something harder, steadier. "For years I watched you teach our son that cruelty is strength," she said, her voice shaking but strong enough to carry. "For years I stayed quiet while you broke him down the same way you tried to break me. But this is where it stops. You don't touch her. You don't touch me. And you will not touch Tyler again." The porch was silent except for the sound of Tyler's sobs muffled against his mother's chest. David's hand lowered slowly, but his jaw worked as if he was chewing on words he could no longer spit. I stood behind Linda, my heart pounding not from fear but from awe. It takes one kind of courage to drag a soldier out of fire and another kind to stand up to the fire inside your own home. She had both. I stepped to her side, then no longer hidden, my voice low but firm. "You see, David's scars don't just belong to the skin. They belong to the choices we make, the truths we carry. And tonight, yours are showing." His eyes flicked between us, his power shrinking with every breath. For the first time, I saw doubt crack through his anger. The man who had tried to crush me with words and threats was now cornered not by violence but by truth. Tyler lifted his head, his small voice trembling but clear. "Dad, stop. Please, just stop." Those words seemed to hang heavier than anything I could have said. David's shoulders slumped, his fury no longer finding a place to land. And in that moment, I realized something. This was not just my fight. It was Linda's fight, Tyler's fight, a breaking of chains that had bound their house in silence for too long. The moment hung in the air, heavy and electric, as David's hand hovered, then fell back to his side. But the fury in his eyes had not dimmed. He stepped back, drew in a sharp breath, and then, with a sudden burst of anger, lunged forward again, his arm cutting through the space between us. My body stiffened, the same reflex I had felt under incoming fire. But before his hand could reach me, Linda's voice rang out fierce and raw. I said not any more. She caught his wrist mid-air with both hands, surprising him with the strength of her grip. For a second they struggled, his muscles flexing against hers, but she held fast, her face blazing with a conviction that stunned me. For years she had lived in his shadow, but in that instant she stepped into her own light. Tyler gasped behind us, his voice high and frightened. "Dad, stop. Please, stop." The boy's tears streaked down his face, his chest heaving, and the sound of his cry pierced deeper than any argument could. David's face twisted as he yanked his hand free, but he did not strike again. Instead, he staggered back a step, his chest rising and falling as if he had just fought a battle he could not win. I steadied my breath, my heart pounding, but my voice calm. "You see, David, strength is not raising your hand. Strength is choosing not to. Strength is facing truth when it terrifies you, and right now the truth is standing in front of you, refusing to be silenced." Linda turned slightly toward me, her eyes fierce but shining. "Hannah's right. You've ruled this house with fear for too long, and look what it's done. Our son mocks people who have survived battles he cannot imagine. I live in fear of your voice, your anger, but no more." Her voice cracked, but she pushed forward. "If you want to call scars weakness, then call me weak too, because I have carried the scar of letting you control us. And tonight, I'm done carrying it." David's mouth opened, but no words came. His silence was louder than his shouting had ever been. Tyler stepped forward, then wiping his face with the back of his hand. He looked at me, really looked, his eyes red and swollen but clear. "I didn't know," he whispered again, his voice trembling. "I thought your scars made you less. But Mom says they mean you survived." He paused, his breath hitching. "That makes you braver than me." The words hit me with unexpected force, cutting through the years of humiliation I had carried. A child who once mocked me was now admitting what so many adults refused to say. My chest tightened, and for the first time in weeks, I felt tears rise not from shame, but from something closer to release. Linda pulled Tyler into her arms again, holding him tight, while David stood off to the side. His authority fractured his anger hollow. The air on the porch felt different now, charged not with fear, but with truth finally spoken aloud. And in that moment, I understood that the fight was no longer about me alone. It was about ending a cycle that had poisoned more than one life. Tyler's small frame trembled as he pulled away from his mother's embrace. His face was blotched with tears, his lower lip quivering, his hands twisting together in front of him, as if he did not know what to do with the guilt spilling out of him. He looked at me again, his voice breaking like glass. "I'm sorry." The words were soft at first, barely more than a whisper, but they carried a weight that pressed against my chest. "I didn't know what your scars meant. I thought they were ugly. I thought they made you less." His voice cracked, and he stumbled over the next words. "I told the other kids you were a monster. I called you names. I wanted them to laugh with me." His tears came harder now, his shoulders shaking. "But I didn't know you almost died. I didn't know Mom saved you. I didn't know you were—" His voice caught, then came out in a rush. "I didn't know you were brave." I felt my throat tighten, my heart torn between anger and compassion. Part of me wanted to let his apology soak in, to tell him he was forgiven, that he was just a boy, repeating the cruelty he had been taught. But another part of me, the part that had spent nights staring at the ceiling replaying his words, felt raw and unready. Those insults had not just been playground taunts. They had reopened wounds I had fought for years to heal. I took a slow breath, steadying myself. "Tyler," I said gently, my voice shaking despite my effort to keep it calm. "Do you know what it feels like to walk into a room and feel every eye stare at you as if you don't belong? Do you know what it feels like to be reduced to one thing you cannot change? That's what your words did. They made me feel smaller than I already did. They made me feel like my scars were chains instead of proof I survived. His tears blurred his vision, but he nodded, swallowing hard. I know now. I didn't understand. I thought it was funny. I didn't see what it did to you. I crouched so that I was at his eye level, the porch light casting shadows across his face. Tyler, understanding is the first step. But apology is not enough unless you change. Words can hurt deeper than fists, and you have to live with the knowledge that yours cut me deeply. If you want forgiveness, you'll need to do more than say sorry. You'll need to stand up the next time someone laughs at someone who looks different. You'll need to remember that scars are not shame, they're stories. Can you do that? He wiped his face with the back of his hand and nodded fiercely, his voice shaking. I can. I will. I don't want to be like Dad. I want to be better. The sincerity in his voice cracked something inside me. My anger did not vanish, but it softened into something I could hold without breaking. I reached out slowly, letting him see my hand before I placed it gently on his shoulder. Tyler, I said quietly, forgiveness is not a gift I give you tonight. It's something you earn every day by choosing to be different. But I believe you can. His tears flowed again, but this time there was relief in them, as if the weight of his actions was finally lifting. And in that fragile moment, I realized this boy who had once been my tormentor was also standing on the edge of change, a chance to break free from the shadow of his father's cruelty. A week later, I stood at the front of a crowded hall in Cincinnati where the Veteran Support Network was holding its monthly gathering. The room buzzed with a conversation, the smell of coffee and old wood filling the air. Folding chairs lined in neat rows. I had been invited to speak before, but I always declined. I told myself my story was private, too painful, too complicated. But after what happened on the Miller porch, after the silence cracked open, I knew I could not keep quiet anymore. Not just for me, but for every veteran who carried scars the world preferred not to see. When my name was called, I walked slowly to the podium, the folder in my hands heavy with photographs and papers I had carried for years. My palms were damp, my throat tight, but when I looked out at the rows of faces, men and women who knew what it meant to fight and survive, I felt something steady rise inside me. I began softly, my voice shaking. My name is Hannah Parker. I served in Iraq. I came home with scars I didn't ask for, scars that have spoken louder than my own voice at times. I paused, letting the silence stretch, letting them lean in. For years, I let those scars be used against me. I let silence protect cruelty. But tonight, I am done being quiet. I lifted the photos, held them high so the crowd could see. This was me after Fallujah, bandaged, burned, barely alive. And this, I said, pulling out the torn certificate Tyler had ripped in front of the class. This was me last month, humiliated in a classroom because a boy repeated the cruelty he learned at home. A murmur rippled through the crowd. I saw heads shake, jaws tighten, tears glisten in eyes that understood too well. Then I took a deep breath and let the words fall steady. That boy's father is here in this room tonight. David Miller! Gasps broke out. Heads turned, and I saw him near the back, his face red, his posture stiff as stone. He hadn't expected me to call him out by name, but I was done protecting the powerful. I pointed toward him, my voice rising. This is the man who called me broken, who threatened me to keep me silent, who raised a child to believe scars are shame. His son tore up the recognition I had earned, called me damaged goods while David cheered him on. The room erupted with whispers, angry voices, a swell of outrage that spread like wildfire. I kept going louder now. You want to know the truth. His wife Linda was the medic who pulled me out of that street in Fallujah. She saved my life. She knows these scars because she held them when they were raw and bleeding. And now, years later, her son mocked them because of the poison David poured into their home. David shouted his voice, trying to drown mine, but the crowd's reaction swallowed him. A veteran in the front row stood up, pointing. Shame on you! Another voice called, You don't deserve to sit here among us. The anger rolled through the room, a wave of solidarity I had never felt before. David's protests fell flat, his words lost under the voices rising against him. I steadied myself at the podium, tears burning in my eyes, but my voice strong. I am not broken. None of us are. Our scars are not signs of weakness. They are proof that we lived, proof that we fought, proof that we refused to fall when the world tried to crush us. If anyone tries to tell you different, stand up. Tell them no more. The applause thundered loud and relentless, drowning out the last of David's rage. I saw him shrink under it, his face pale now, his authority crumbling in the very place he thought he could intimidate. And in that moment, I knew his downfall was sealed. In the days that followed, the Cincinnati gathering, the echoes of that night spread faster than I could have imagined. Someone had recorded my speech on their phone, and within 24 hours, the video was being shared across veteran forums, social media groups, and even picked up by a local news outlet that ran the headline, "Veteran Stands Against Bullying, Calls Out Abusive Father." I watched the views climb in disbelief, watched the comments pour in, strangers thanking me for saying out loud what so many of them had buried in silence. But while my world began to feel lighter, David Miller's began to collapse. Within a week, he had been called into his company's office in Dayton. They had seen the video, seen the outrage online, and they did not want his name attached to theirs. He was dismissed quietly, no fanfare, no chance to defend himself. Word of his behavior spread through his community, whispered at church, at the grocery store, even at the bar where he once held court with friends. Now men avoided his table, women turned away, and his voice no longer carried authority. It carried shame. Tyler's school heard as well. Teachers and parents called for action. The boy was not expelled, but he was placed in counseling, and David was barred from attending school events after reports of his past intimidation surfaced. The same man who had once puffed up his chest to bully others now stood stripped of respect in every circle he entered. As for me, something shifted that I had not expected. For the first time in years, I walked into public spaces without pulling my sleeves down, without hiding behind shadows. The scars on my arms still drew stares, but now I met those stares with steady eyes. And more often than not, someone would come up afterward and say, "I saw your speech. Thank you." One woman at the grocery store pressed my hand in hers and whispered that her son had come home from Afghanistan scarred too, and now he held his head higher because of my story. Those moments were worth more than medals, more than recognition. They were proof that the pain I carried could turn into something greater than itself. I will not pretend everything was easy. David tried to send messages through mutual acquaintances, bitter words about how I had ruined his life. But each time I heard them, I remembered his raised hand on the porch, the trembling voice of his son begging him to stop, and I knew I had only spoken the truth. Linda stood firm as well. Within 2 weeks, she filed for separation, her voice stronger than I had ever seen it. She told me she had lived half her life under his thumb and was ready to step out from under it. Tyler visited me once with her eyes still cautious but filled with determination. He said he was working hard in therapy, that he wanted to be someone his mom and I could be proud of. I told him that was his journey to walk, but that I believed he could. At night, when I looked at myself in the mirror, I no longer saw only the burned skin and the jagged marks of fire. I saw the reflection of a woman who had finally stopped running from her own story. Justice was not about revenge alone. It was about truth breaking chains. It was about knowing that silence no longer held me hostage. And as I turned off the light, I whispered the words that had carried me through the worst. I am not broken. I am alive. And I will never be silent again. The weeks after my speech felt like stepping into a new life, one I hadn't dared to believe was possible. For years, my identity had been wrapped in silence and survival, in carrying the weight of scars that told only half the story. But now, with the truth spoken aloud and the echo of it still resonating, I felt that weight begin to shift. Linda called me one evening from a small apartment she had just rented in Dayton. Her voice sounded tired, worn down, but steadier than the trembling tones I remembered from the night on the porch. "Hannah, it's done. I filed the papers. He can't touch me anymore." The way she said it with a firmness edged by relief told me this was not a woman running away in fear. It was a woman choosing herself for the first time in decades. She explained how she had packed Tyler's things quietly, how they left when David was away for the afternoon. Tyler was now enrolled in counseling sessions set up by the school and supported by a veteran outreach program that had stepped in after my story gained traction. Linda had found a job at a community clinic, not glamorous but steady, and she said for the first time in years she could breathe without waiting for the sound of a slammed door. As she spoke, I realized that exposing David had not just been about clearing my own name or confronting my own pain. It had created ripples freeing Linda from the prison of intimidation and giving Tyler a chance to grow in a different light. For me, healing came in quieter, slower steps. I began volunteering at the VA in Cleveland, a few hours' drive from my home in Columbus. The first time I walked into the support group for female veterans, I felt the old reflex tug at me to hide my arms to sit in the back. But then I remembered the faces in Cincinnati, the applause that had followed my words, and I chose a seat in the front instead. I listened to women tell their stories, one who had been burned in a Humvee explosion, another who carried the limp of shrapnel lodged too deep to remove. Their words cracked open the silence that had bound us all, and when my turn came, I told them about Fallujah. I told them about Linda's hands on my skin, about the little boy who called me a monster, about how truth turned even that cruelty into something else. And when I finished, one woman reached across the table, touched my hand, and said softly, "You gave us permission to stop hiding." Those words stayed with me. Every time I returned to the VA, I found myself speaking louder, sharing not just my pain, but also the small victories, like wearing short sleeves in public or walking into a grocery store without bracing for stares. The women listened, and slowly I saw them begin to do the same. It was not dramatic or sudden, but it was real. Healing, I realized, is not about erasing scars. It is about changing the story they tell. At home, my nights grew easier. The nightmares that had haunted me for years came less frequently. When they did come, I woke not in panic but in reflection, reminding myself that the fire had not destroyed me. It had marked me, yes, but it had also revealed a strength I had not known existed. I began writing down my memories in a journal, snippets of childhood in Toledo, flashes of Iraq, moments of pain, and moments of courage. I didn't know if I would ever share them beyond those pages, but the act of writing was a way of reclaiming them, of making them mine again. Linda visited me once months after leaving David, and we sat on my porch as the summer air buzzed with cicadas. She looked healthier, her eyes brighter. Tyler was playing in the yard with a soccer ball, his laughter carrying on the breeze. She turned to me, her voice low but clear. "You saved us, Hannah. Not just that night in Iraq, not just on the porch, but by standing up when no one else would." I shook my head, humbled. "No, Linda. You saved me first." And in that moment, I believed we had saved each other. It was early autumn when Tyler finally asked to see me again, this time without Linda at his side. She drove him to my house in Columbus and waited in the car, giving him space to take the step on his own. I met him at the porch, the air crisp and filled with the scent of fallen leaves. He looked taller, older somehow, though it had only been a few months. His hair was a little longer, his backpack slung loosely over one shoulder. He shifted nervously, glancing at my arms, then back at the ground. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice tentative but clear. I nodded and led him inside. We sat at the kitchen table, the afternoon light slanting across the wood. He fidgeted with the strap of his backpack before blurting out, "I need to say sorry again. Not because Mom told me to, not because of what happened at that meeting, but because I still think about it every day. The way I treated you, the words I used, I can't forget them, and I don't want to be that person anymore." His honesty struck me. I leaned forward, folding my hands together. Tyler, apologies are not about erasing the past. They're about choosing who you will be from now on. You hurt me, yes, but you also stood on the porch that night and promised to be better. Have you kept that promise? He swallowed hard, his cheeks flushed. I think so. At school, when other kids teased a new boy with a limp, I told them to stop. I told them he was braver than they knew. They laughed at me, but I didn't care. I kept thinking about you, about what you said, that scars are stories. He paused, then added, I even told them about you, about Fallujah, about how you survived. For a long moment I was quiet, letting his words sink in. Then I rolled up my sleeves, bearing the scars that ran like rivers across my arms. Tyler stared, his eyes wide, but not with fear, not with disgust. There was something else there now. Recognition. Respect. I lifted my arm slightly, holding it out toward him. Do you see these? These are not marks of shame. These are warrior marks. They tell the story of survival of battles fought and endured, and they are part of me not to be hidden, not to be mocked, but to be carried with pride. His eyes glistened. Can I touch them? I nodded. Slowly, with the hesitation of someone who knew the weight of his own past cruelty, he reached out and let his fingers brush lightly over the scarred skin. His touch was gentle, reverent. They feel... He paused, searching for the word. Strong. A lump rose in my throat. Yes, Tyler, they are strong. And so are you, if you choose to be. He withdrew his hand and wiped at his eyes, quickly embarrassed by his own tears. I don't deserve your forgiveness, he whispered. Forgiveness, I said softly, is not something you deserve. It's something you build. And today, by being here, by choosing to face what you did instead of hiding from it, you've built the first piece. We sat in silence for a while after that, the weight of the moment settling between us. Outside, I could hear Linda's car radio faintly, the sound of a song carried by the wind. For the first time, I saw in Tyler not the boy who had mocked me, but the boy who could grow into someone different, someone kind. When he finally stood to leave, he looked at me once more. Thank you, Hannah, for giving me another chance. I smiled, my chest tight with emotion. Don't thank me. Thank yourself for taking it. After they drove away, I stepped back onto the porch and let the cool air wash over me. I thought about the journey that had brought me here from the streets of Toledo, where fear first shaped me to the sands of Fallujah, where fire tried to claim me to the porch in Dayton, where truth finally broke free. I thought about Linda reclaiming her voice, about Tyler learning to rewrite his story, about the veterans who had stood and clapped when I refused to stay silent. And then I thought about myself, about the reflection I would see tonight in the mirror. The scars would still be there, but they no longer told a story of pain alone. They told a story of survival, of defiance, of justice. They were proof not that I had been broken, but that I had endured. I whispered the words I wanted every veteran, every survivor, every person carrying marks the world could not understand to hear. You are not less. You are not your pain. You are more. That night, as the stars spread across the Ohio sky, I knew the war inside me was finally ending. Not because the scars had disappeared, but because I had learned to carry them differently. They were no longer chains. They were the language of resilience, and I would speak them proudly for the rest of my life. The months after Tyler's visit unfolded with a quiet rhythm that felt almost foreign to me, like slipping into a life I had once watched from a distance, but never believed I could touch. My days were filled with volunteering at the VA, speaking at schools when invited, and writing in the journal that had become both anchor and compass. Each entry was another piece of myself claimed back, another wound stitched not with shame, but with meaning. What surprised me most was how ordinary moments began to feel extraordinary. Walking through the aisles of a grocery store in short sleeves and catching the eye of someone who had seen the video, who offered a nod of respect rather than a whisper of judgment. Sitting on my porch in the evening light, listening to the sounds of children laughing on the street and realizing I no longer feared their laughter was aimed at me. Answering phone calls from strangers across the country who had heard my story and wanted to share their own scars, physical or invisible, and hearing in their voices the same tremble of hope I had once thought was lost. I thought about Linda often, how she had carved a new life for herself, piece by piece, shedding the shadows of David's control. She told me she still struggled, still woke, sometimes expecting to hear his voice raised, but now she had her own apartment filled with sunlight and Tyler's laughter. Tyler himself had changed in ways I had not thought possible. When I saw him again at a community event months later, he stood tall and steady, introducing me to his classmates as a veteran who had survived a war. Not the burned soldier, not the broken woman, but someone he now called a mentor. In his young voice, I heard the echo of growth that could ripple through generations. One night, after returning from a speaking event in Dayton, I stood in front of the mirror. The scars reflected back at me the same ridges and marks that had once filled me with dread, but now I saw them differently. They were not reminders of what I had lost, but of what I had carried, what I had won. They were maps of resilience carved into my skin, permanent proof that I had faced both fire and cruelty and had refused to vanish. I whispered aloud, almost to myself, but also to the world I knew was listening. They once made me hide. Now they make me fight louder. And in that whisper, I felt the circle close, the war inside me finally silenced. I want to leave you with this. Scars are not shame. They are not endings. They are beginnings carved into our bodies, proof that we fought. Proof that we endured, proof that we refused to surrender when life demanded it. For me, they are reminders of a fire in Fallujah, of a medic named Linda who refused to give up, of a child named Tyler who learned to see differently, of a woman who finally chose to stop hiding. They are also reminders of you. The ones listening now, the ones who carry scars the world does not always see. Maybe yours are on your skin. Maybe they are buried deeper, hidden beneath layers of silence. But they matter. They tell your story. If you have ever been mocked for what you could not control, if you have ever been silenced by shame or cruelty, I want you to know you are not alone. Your story deserves to be told. And if you feel brave enough, share it here. Tell me what your scars mean to you. Tell me about the battles you fought that no one else could see. Because when we speak our truths aloud, when we let the world see us not as broken, but as survivors, we build a bridge that cannot be torn down by cruelty or ignorance. So I ask you now, as someone who has walked through fire and found her voice again, what do your scars say about you? What story do they tell? Share it below. And if my journey resonated with you, if it reminded you of your own strength, then stay with me. Subscribe so that together we can keep building a place where scars are no longer hidden, where survival is honored, where truth is louder than fear. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss a story that might change the way you see your own reflection. Because one thing I know for certain, scars tell stories, and those stories deserve to be heard.